kind of practice of what I use the word appropriation. Sometimes I even talk about cultural appropriation as a spiritual practice. And what I'm talking about there is an aspect of Buddhist thought and praxis and sort of subject formation that kind of equips Buddhist practitioners for travel, for portability, and for the establishment of place or a certain kind of place consciousness wherever they may find themselves. Yeah. And in Tibetan tradition, there's an emphasis in certain kinds of Dharma practice on a kind of nomadism. For example, you see this a lot in the Chöd practice, where actually, becoming homeless is part of one's commitment to the spiritual practice. There's a Bodhisattva mind training, a famous text called the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva, where early in the text it says, to leave one's home is to accomplish half the Dharma. So, there is a kind of rootedness that happens, if you're burying treasure vases or something, that seems like a kind of permanent thing to do in a way. There's a kind of dialectic, I guess you could say, between a sort of emplacement, right? But then also a kind of transcendence of place, for lack of a better term, a kind of spatiality starts to enter in here. Mm-hmm. So, the nature of mind, the deep nature of mind, is distinguished from our typical experience or identity or sense of what the mind is, like as a collection of attitudes or cognitive capacities, etc. When the mind is drawn inward in the sense that the mind looks at mind or looks for mind, then, so the teachings go and the meditation instructions go, that normal sense of self or subjectivity is seen to be without substance. And yet still experience continues with its luminosity and its it's sort of spontaneous variety. And so there's this interesting kind of thing here where the self can't be found, but that's this sort of liberating not finding. And sort of phenomenologically, what that has to do with is an experience of vast spaciousness. And so here we kind of have this sense that liberation is sort of transplacial. It has to do, metaphor is often spoken of as the preeminent kind of image for the nature of mind. Longchenpa writes about this. I translated some pieces of his work where he discusses this. And so there's this kind of interesting dialectic between place, which is in some ways synonymous with samsara, and then nirvana as this kind of non-localizable sort of nature of wisdom. The word apratishtita nirvana is used for this sort of non-localizable nirvana. But the thing is that it's not this sort of acosmic removal from place, because what's talked about here is that when one is no longer structuring one's experience in terms of this kind of egoic, limited, sort of privileged point in this space of mind, then what happens on the other side of that? Well, there are texts that describe this. And so, for example, in the Yogacara tradition, like in the Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, Mahayana Sutra Alankara is a text that talks about this, where what emerges on the other side of that non-localizable realization is a total transformation of the geographic surround, right? And so the emergence of what's called the Buddha bodies or kayas arises here, but Buddha body as a translation of kaya is somewhat misleading. Some people have proposed dimension as a translation of kaya. One of the reasons for that is because this kaya includes the place and the time, and a communicative event that involves a teacher, a retinue of students, and a message being transmitted. And so what you have here is the kind of refining of experience so that it's no longer sort of me versus the world, the kind of skin encapsulated ego, but instead it's recognized to be an embodied and emplaced event of a communicative event. And so that's this sort of interesting thing where the Buddha is not just in, but as places. So, but again, essentially non-localizable. So there's this kind of interesting sort of dialectical thing going on there. So you asked me about, these practices in Tibet. And I told you that my emphasis is more sort of philosophical, but, I think you can see this kind of effort to sort of continue this sort of practice of appropriation, of emplacement, wherever Buddhists find themselves. And so that's happening now again under the conditions of today, which involves this diasporic spread of Buddhism beyond the old boundaries of Tibet.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's very, I guess, provocative use of the idea of cultural appropriation
Right.
because it's such a, I guess, just controversial and contested
Yeah.
kind of political issue these days. And to think like, well, not all appropriation looks like what we think cultural appropriation looks like in mass media these days. And
Mm-hmm.
you're seeing this kind of a healthier version of appropriation. It reminds me in Stoicism, there's a concept of appropriation that's really just like making your home.
Right.
And the word for it is oikiosis. And so it's the same oik that's in oikos of home.
Sure.
So I think this is like a fundamentally ecological point, this idea of cultural appropriation. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I like that a lot. That's one of those things. There's a handful of things in your dissertation defense that I was hearing that I was like, ooh, that's a meaty kind of thing to say, and lots of implications
Yeah.
there.